write about issues that cut across religion, politics, education, science, technology, anything really that kind of reframes a problem from the perspective of the social justice, particularly as it pertains to women, particularly as it pertains to intersectionality. And actually it's just an intellectual framework, and so you can apply it in any of these contexts. So that's what I talk about. One of my main objectives was that girls and women stop getting sick, like physically and mentally ill, because of social prohibitions on their defending themselves or expressing themselves or demanding accountability from the people around them. So I document the ways in which that happens, the ways in which the diversion or suppression or repression or, very unhealthy manifestations of anger come back to bite us. And I acknowledge that there are real penalties to expressing your own needs, because that's what expressing anger is. You're literally expressing a need or a perception of risk or threat. And so the question is, why don't the people around you care what you're saying is important to you? The subtitle of the book is The Power of Women's Anger, and actually we had a long conversation, my editor, my agent, and I, about whether to qualify power, and ended up leaving it unqualified because, in fact, it can be powerfully positive, or as we generally know and perceive, negative. And so the book is about the tax on women for feeling or displaying this emotion, and how it's socially constructed really to protect the status quo, to protect status quo inequalities. If you're angry as a woman, chances are that the first response is going to be mockery or belittlement, which is kind of a form of infantilization, which ultimately means that you need to be governed, and that your anger doesn't have political legitimacy. And in fact, the anger that many of us feel is the most rational response to the situation that we find ourselves in. And it's not an anger of resentment or contempt, but an anger of hope and compassion. One of the things that I've been keeping track of is disparate responses to when women tell their stories. And what we've seen in a movement like Me Too or Black Lives Matters, which was started by, 3 queer women of color, what we see is that the social response to those narratives, to those perspectives, is often so negative that there's a lot of doubt. And I think that often comes down to identity threats. This knowledge is a threat to identity and status. And so the cognitive response is to deny or silence or aggress. And after hashtag movements like Yes All Women, Not Okay, where you had millions of women pouring out these stories, some of them for the first time even acknowledging these experiences, there was a lot of defensive denial. And all of these studies show double-digit gaps in men believing women and believing these stories. And so the question is, why wouldn't they believe women? Especially, which is so often the case, when women have to come together by the thousands, tens of thousands, and millions to say the same thing. That's how big the credibility gap is. It's never one woman. And I think a lot of that has to do with this notion of identity protective cognition. So if all of a sudden women, and it might be, as people are fond of saying, my sister, my mother, my daughter, are saying, I'm not protected. I'm telling you that I'm not protected. I don't feel safe. I'm hypervigilant. I'm sexually harassed at work or in my school or in my sport. That translates into failure. I am failing to protect. And that's a threat. That's a threat to identity. And so we see that all the time when women are angry. their anger is downgraded. The language around it is demeaning or minimizing or trivializing. I'm irritated, I'm stressed, it's such a bother. Instead of just saying, I'm really angry because X happened, and having someone just listen and say, what can I do to help?